In this video, we'll be discussing solving one- and two-step inequalities, which is very similar to solving one- and two-step equations with one exception, which you'll see. Our first inequality is 12 plus x is greater than -4. So if we imagine for a second that this is really an equation, which it's not, but let's just imagine for a second. So 12 plus x is equal to -4. How would you solve that? You would think to yourself, what's happening to x? Well, it's being added to 12. What's the inverse operation? Subtracting 12. And you would go ahead and subtract 12 from both sides, and you would have x is equal to -16. And you'd be done. But this isn't an equation, it's an inequality, so let's just rewrite it as an inequality. 12 plus x is greater than -4. And then we use inverse operations just like we did in the equation. And we get x is greater than -16. And so again, we'll use that down here when we type it in. And the difference here is that we have greater than and less than signs, or greater than and equal to signs, which are up here, less than and equal to signs. So we'll use these as we get into those other styles of inequalities. So up here, it already has the statement, x is, and we're just going to answer what it is. So this is x is greater than -16. X is greater than -16. Once we've done that, we're done with that question. So you can see how it's very similar to equations. Here's our next one. 26 is greater than 13 minus x. So if this was an equation, it would be 26 equals 13 minus x. We would say, what's happening to x? Well, it's being added to 13, and it's being multiplied by -1. So we'll subtract 13 and get 13 equals -x, and then we'll divide by -1. And we have -13 equals x. That's how it would look if it was an equation. It's not an equation. Let's do it as an inequality. And this is where the one difference comes in when you're doing inequalities. So we subtract 13. We get 13 is greater than -x, so everything's still the same. If you multiply or divide by a negative number, you have to flip the direction of the sign. So that's a key concept. If you multiply or divide by a negative number, this hashtag #, that means number. If you multiply or divide by a negative number, you have to flip the sign, the inequality sign. So our inequality sign right now is facing to the right. It's opening to the right. So when we divide by -1 on both sides, we'll have -13 is less than x. So you can see that now it's opening to the right. It was opening to the left up here. Now it's opening to the right down here. And that's important because when I write this, it says x is. So what is x? Well, x is greater than, see how this inequality sign is trying to eat the x? So x is greater than -13. When I type it in, I'll write greater than -13. So we'll go on to our next example and explain a little bit more about how the flipping of the inequality signs works. Y is greater than or equal to -13 plus x. So we kind of understand how to do it if it looks like an equation. We're just going to go ahead and do this one straight through. So 5 is greater than or equal to -13 plus x. What's happening to x? It's being subtracted by 13. So we'll go ahead and add 13. And we end up with 18 is greater than or equal to x. So has anything happened to x? Have we multiplied or divided by anything? No, we have not. So do we need to flip the sign? No, we do not. So I'm going to rewrite it now with x on the left-hand side. Again, I'm not flipping the sign, I'm just rewriting it, and watch what happens. So right now, this is opening to 18. So 18 is greater than or equal to x. So if I write x over here, what's greater? X or 18? 18 is. So here's my 18. 18 is greater than x. It looks like I just flipped the sign. I did not. The sign is opening to 18. The sign is opening to 18. Nothing has changed. So when I write it in down here, I'm going to use this this less than or equal to, greater than or equal to sign. So x is, what is x? It's less than or equal to 18. So x is less than or equal to 18. Here's our next one. What's happening to x? It's being divided by 20. The inverse is to multiply by 20. Is my inverse operation multiplying or dividing by a negative? No. Do I need to flip the sign? No. So 20 times negative 20 is negative 400 is greater than or equal to x. Again, I need x to be on the right side, or on the left side. It's on the right side now. This is opening to 400, so when I write x and negative 400, I'm going to have it opening towards negative 400. And I go ahead and I type that in. X is less than or equal to negative 400. Here's our next one. I'm multiplying by 18, which means I need to divide by 18. 162 divided by 18 is 9. So we have 9 is greater than or equal to x. Again, I need x to be on the left-hand side because I want it to say x is less than or equal to 9. 9 is greater up here. 9 is greater down here. Nothing has changed. So x is less than or equal to 9. Here's the next one. Here I have a double sign. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of this double sign. Two negative signs together are actually two positive signs. So I have x plus 11 is less than 27. What's happening to x? Well, it's being added to 11. So the inverse operation, subtract 11. And I have x is less than 16. X is already on the left-hand side. I can just go ahead and type it in. X is less than 16. This is a two-step inequality, so I'm going to go ahead and simplify. Anytime that you have multiple steps, anytime that you have multiple terms, you need to make sure that you simplify. So I have an x term here. I have an x term here. I need to make sure I simplify those, and I get 10 is greater than 5x. What's happening to x? It's being multiplied by 5. What's the inverse of multiplying by 5? Dividing by 5. So now I have 2 is greater than x. I need x on the left-hand side. So x is less than 2. 2 is bigger up here. 2 is bigger down here. This is the same, just rewritten. So x is less than 2. Again, I have a multi-step equation here. And I need to simplify my like terms. So here is a constant, here is a constant, and I end up with 4 is less than or equal to 6x plus 4. My inverse operation is to subtract 4. And I have 0 is less than or equal to x, 6x. I divide by 6. 0 divided by 6 is 0, is less than or equal to x. I need the x on the left-hand side, because that's how it's written here, x is. So x is greater than or equal to 0. And I'll go ahead and put it in that way. Greater than or equal to 0. My next example, negative 5x minus 8x. These are like terms that I need to combine. So I end up with negative 13x is greater than or equal to 0. I divide by negative 13. And because I divided by a negative, I'm going to flip this sign. Now the sign has flipped. This is x still. this is 0. Again, if you multiply or divide by a negative, which we did, we divided by a negative, your sign, your inequality sign, changes directions. X is already on the left-hand side. I don't need to change anything there. X is less than or equal to 0. Our next multi-step, these are like terms that I need to combine. So 18, fix that one. 18 is greater than 3x. I divide by 3. And 6 is greater than x. I need x to be on the left-hand side because that's how it's written. X is something. So x is less than 6. 6 is bigger up here. 6 is bigger down here. Nothing has changed. So x is less than 6 is how I'll write that in. Example 11, multi-step. I have 8 minus 3, which is 5. I have my negative 4 still, negative 4x plus 5 is less than or equal to 17. I subtract 5, and I have negative 4x is less than or equal to 12. I divide by negative 4. Right now in your minds, the alarm's going off. You divided by a negative, you divided by a negative. I have to change something, I have to change something. What do you have to change? You have to flip the sign. So the inequality sign has now been flipped, and I have x is greater than or equal to negative 3. And that's how I'll type it in. X is greater than or equal to negative 3. Last example. 1 is greater than or equal to 1 plus 2x minus 6x. So these are my like terms. And I get 1 is greater than or equal to 1 minus 4x. I go ahead and subtract 1 from both sides, and I have 0 is greater than or equal to negative 4x. And then I need to divide by negative 4. What's happening in your mind right now? That alarm's going off, isn't it? So that means my inequality sign is shifting. I divided by a negative. I've divided by a negative. I need to switch my sign. So it changes directions, and I have 0 is less than or equal to x. Now I need to make sure that x is on the left-hand side because it says x is. So x is greater than or equal to 0. X was greater here, x was greater there, nothing has changed. That's our last example. Good job. Make sure that when you solve these, you do it just like 1- and 2-step equations, but if you multiply or divide by a negative, you need to flip the direction of the inequality sign. Good luck.